record to cloud. And I hope that doesn't deter folks from ringing in. We're not going to talk about anything particularly challenging or threatening, I hope, but I'd like this to be as interactive as possible. Good afternoon. Welcome to my kitchen. My kids are on spring break, and I didn't realize that their spring break had been moved a week when I planned this pit stop. So we're just going to go with the flow. If you hear dogs or Marvel movies in the background, just, enjoy it. It's going to be good. For those of you who are joining right now, we're going to do a Menti in a minute, so you can open up a second browser and type in menti.com. Of course, this is a pit stop, which stands for Pedagogy, Innovation, and Technology. These are monthly events that we hold for faculty system-wide. We record all of them and we make them available online at the TCI YouTube channel, as well as on the Provost website. So if you have a colleague who said that they couldn't come and wanted to make it, you can just refer them there. We often include the slides that were used during the presentation. That will be the case today. So it will take me a few days to get it up, but you can go to the Provost website and find these materials there. We have one more pit stop on the agenda for this semester, and this will be an external speaker who will be joining us. His name is Daniel Reinholtz, hails from San Diego State University, and I wanted to invite him to talk to our faculty about some tools that he's been developing. Daniel's really interested in issues that are revolve around equity, inclusion, and access and diversity. And he's a math faculty member. He has agreed to join us to share a tool that he has developed with his research team. It's a customizable observation protocol, which allows you to quantify the types of participation that's happening in your classroom so that you can determine the degree to which there's more equity in that classroom environment. That won't be the only thing he talks about. He'll be sharing some other tips and strategies from his research, but I really wanted to highlight the observation protocol, particularly for those of you who are engaged in peer observation of other instructors in your unit or across campus, because it could just be one tool in your arsenal that you could use to collect some more objective data about the classroom experience. So please keep checking your email for that. Check the TCI website for Zoom information. I'm also looking for ideas. I'll post this slide again at the end of the presentation, but I work in collaboration with other folks on other campuses to set the annual schedule for pit stops. And really, we want these to be useful for you, the faculty, and we're running out of ideas. I'm kidding. I have lots of ideas, but I want to make sure that the things that we offer next year are really responsive to your needs. As predominantly as an instructor, we really are focused on what the classroom experience is, but it could also be about how to support you as a scholarly teacher. So I want you to think about both sides of the coin there in thinking about what kind of programming we can offer you. Pit stops generally, right? We have one that is system-wide, and then if we find that there are faculty on particular campuses that have an additional need or want some extension work, we often offer those ad hoc on our own campuses. So just be thinking about what you might want next year. And if you don't get a chance to fill this out, you can always send an email to me or to the TCI in general, and we'll have that information as we set up the calendar for next year. So today I invited you here to talk about assessment, which is sort of my favorite topic in the world. And I wanted to share with you my experiences with a type of assessment called contract grading. And I'm gonna just start out by saying I am by no means the expert on contract grading. I've dabbled in it. I've talked to a lot of people who've done it. I've had positive experiences. I've had not so positive experiences, but really this is just to open up a conversation about assessment where we can gain ideas from one another and then find buddies that maybe we want to talk about this after today's pit stop. So to get us ready for this conversation, I want to hear from you first a little bit. And so that's what the Menti is for. I'm going to switch my screens here. Where'd you go, buddy? There we go. And I have just a few questions for you. The first one, so if you haven't logged on yet, ooh, this is hard to do with Zoom. It's killing all my bandwidth or my PC power. Okay. So if you haven't yet, you can log on to www.menti.com. You can see the web address and the code up above for joining this survey. And I'd like you to just take a few seconds. I didn't want this to be identifiable, but I did want to get a feel, kind of put my fingers on your wrist and get a pulse. What does assessment mean to you? So you should be able to type in a short sentence or two and let me know what you're thinking about assessment.
Erika, I'm not seeing that question. I'm seeing a question, what might make assessment challenging for an instructor?
That's the next question. So I think you may have moved up a question. And I'm not sure why or how to get you back to the first question.
Okay, all right.
That's
I don't
okay,
know how I
Christine.
got here.
I don't
Thanks.
either. Usually I have classes too big to use Menti, so I'm not really great at using it. So I appreciate all your patience. And if you can't access Menti, please go ahead, drop it in the chat if you feel comfortable. That's okay too. Okay. I love this one. Determining if students are gaining what you hoped they would learn. That's how I feel. I'm functioning on a hope and a prayer a lot of the time. Gauging what students have learned. Okay, good. Yeah. I love seeing this additional response. Someone posted feedback for me and my students. So often we do think about the endpoint that we're trying to determine what it is that students know or what they're able to do. Sometimes we're focused on content, conceptual understanding. Others of us might be teaching courses where we're developing a professional skill. But often we think about what the end product is, but then, effective assessment is that which also embeds feedback into it so that students and us, we can kind of see where the student is in progress and then support them with good feedback. Great. All right, so we can kind of see what we're trying to do with assessment. Ideally, we're trying to see what they know. We have to assign a grade to it because that's the kind of institution we're in. And so sometimes we get hung up on the grading part. Our students certainly can get hung up on the grade part. But if we're working in concert with our students, we can use assessment as a really powerful tool to help support them learning and going forward. Okay, another question for you, Christine. This is where you started, and some of you have already moved ahead. What might make assessment challenging for us as instructors? And I'll give just another second for folks to move in there. I see a lot of concerns about time. It's difficult, so assessment gets harder the more students you have. if you're somebody who really values growth, um, as something that you want to lean into as a teacher, sometimes assessment can feel at odds with that if you eventually have to judge proficiency or competency later on. There are definitely issues around equity with assessment. Our students come into the classroom with a diversity of backgrounds, learning abilities, and we come in with not much training. So those two things can make a recipe for disaster in terms of equitable assessment. It's hard to do class-wide assessments, but also balance that with students' choice and voice. Wonderful. Time. Yeah. Finding the appropriate tools. So I see a rubric, finding the right rubric that would allow you to be consistent and not be overly time consuming is challenging. Yeah, yes, Yvonne, like actually knowing that you're assessing what you want, that you're measuring what you think you're measuring. That's a huge challenge. What about from your students' perspective? What might make assessment challenging for them? And maybe Menti isn't working, or maybe it's just slow on my end, but I don't see any answers in there yet. Let me know if something's wrong out there in Zoom land, please. Okay. Might be some anxiety or fear that our students are feeling. Clarity in the expectations. So what might seem really clear to us as instructors might not be so clear for our students. Misalignment between what is expected. All or nothing attitude. So students feeling like if they fail once, it's going to be done. They won't have an opportunity to come back from that. Yeah, attachment to results. So that's a good one. So for some of these courses, assessment can actually be rather high stakes. If it's a course that's required to have a good grade, to get into professional school, or to be considered for a fellowship or an internship, it can be very high stakes, and that can be difficult. Time it's taking away from what they see as real teaching. Yeah, so our students and some faculty, develop an idea that teaching is talking, and teaching isn't talking. Teaching is providing opportunities for students to grapple with information and to get feedback and practice and improve. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing and go back here. Thank you so much for sharing your ideas about this. I mean, really, we're pretty homogeneous in how we're thinking about assessment, which makes me happy. I've done this before in various situations, and sometimes I hear people saying it's just the assignment of a grade. It's what I have to do. It's very performatory. And that's not the case with you all. I guess I shouldn't be surprised if you're volunteering your afternoon to come talk about teaching and learning, but that's fabulous. I think the biggest thing I take away from assessment every time I think about it is I am concerned that I'm measuring what I think I'm measuring. And I'm also concerned that I'm not measuring what is important. And sometimes that can be ameliorated by talking with a colleague or with a broader group of colleagues, either in my department or even nationally, to talk about what does it mean to be a biochemist, for example. That's my discipline. And then I do worry about equity. What are the ways that I can assess students in a way that includes them and is equitable? So let me get back to the PowerPoint slide here. All right, so I lured you here with the big flashy promise of talking about contract grading. And I get the impression, based on many of the responses I got from the email invitation to the faculty, that people have heard about contract grading, but may not know how to do it, unless that you don't know what it is. But for those of you who aren't familiar with contract grading, it is a form of standards-based assessment. And, the way I would really like to juxtapose this is that more traditional ways of assessing or thinking about grading in higher education has been, we're going to take all of our students and we're going to pit them against one another. We're going to look at the distribution of scores and hopefully it's normal. It never is. But then determine 15% of students are going to get A's, right? And you decide these cutoffs with the idea that there's a curve and only a certain number of people should be achieving at certain levels. Contract grading is different than that. It's really saying that based on the belief that all of our students have the capacity to achieve competency or mastery, and by defining what we mean by our standards for our course, we're allowing our students to have a very clear goal in mind, and then we can support them in the progression toward that. So ideally, or I shouldn't say ideally, but in reality, if you're adopting a contract-based grading system, you could, in theory, have, all of your students get A's and B's, right? If that's what they desire and that's how it works out. Another hallmark of contract grading is that it establishes a mutual agreement between the student and the instructor about what those levels of competency or mastery are. What are the standards that they're trying to meet? And in some cases with contract grading, that's negotiated. Like there's a whole step where you would spend some time negotiating with your students, either on an individual level or a class level. I'm more familiar with identifying for myself using disciplinary standards, what the competencies are, and then communicating to my students how I want them to demonstrate that competency. And then the negotiation actually happens in how they're going to demonstrate. This approach really does encourage student voice and choice. I think it's a really nice model if you combine it with other principles of sound instructional design. If you think about universal design for learning, and if you think about evidence-based ways of engaging students in the classroom, I think that they can all be mutually reinforcing and supporting students. And ideally, with contract grading, it really provides an opportunity for iteration for our students, no one and done, which is what students are scared about, and also feedback so that they can get the support that they need to improve. It's also been shown, the research has shown that contract grading can tap into students' motivation because we're giving them voice and choice. We can see in the literature that students more often choose to engage in different ways in the classroom, higher levels of engagement, higher levels of motivation. So that's another advantage of contract grading. If you Google contract grading, you'll get tons of centers for teaching and learning, which will describe all sorts of flavors of contract grading. I really like this one because it boils it down to 3. One is a mode that we call guaranteed grade. If you do this set of tasks or assignments or whatever it is, you will be guaranteed such and such a grade. Okay, and so you'll see some people do this at the C level because that makes sense, because then the student can progress on and take the next course and keep going. You can see other people that'll say, here's where the B is, and then you have to do more or less for an A. But anyway, this is just where you make a deal with the students up front. This is what you need to do. This is what you're going to get. A variation on the theme is, and this is more often done with smaller classes, and that is here an instructor would convey to their students, Here are the competencies I want you to develop. Here are the assignments that I have designed that align with those competencies. And you're going to work at your own pace. Here are the assignment guidelines. Here are the expectations. Here are some rubrics and checklists that you can use to self-evaluate. Often there's peer evaluation in here where the instructor might suggest a timeline for when assignments are at their first draft stage, and then they, build in some suggestions for peer review. But ultimately, with this model, the students then assign themselves a grade based on the rubrics and checklists. And then the instructor reviews the students' work and their set of rubrics and checklists. And then there's sort of a negotiation that happens where the instructor views the student work and agrees with the student's self-assessment. Other times the instructor might not agree, and then the student gets to make the case why they met expectations or didn't. They are also empowered to think about alternative ways of demonstrating competency for the instructor. So there's a lot more negotiation in this type of contract grading. And like I said, because of the negotiation piece, it tends to be with smaller classes, because this would be quite time consuming with a larger class. And then another one is really identifying not just competency, but mastery. And so in this flavor of contract grading, it's really articulating what mastery of the key concepts or skills looks like. And there's multiple opportunities to revise until the student demonstrates mastery. Okay. What I find is that in general, nobody really sticks to any single one of these flavors. It's usually an amalgam, because you're trying to design this sort of assessment strategy in a way that really meets the needs of your course, your students, your learning outcomes. So what I want to do is just give you a couple examples of how I've seen it used, and then allow you to just ask questions or poke holes in it, or think about how you might do it in your own course. Okay. I'm not saying that this is by any means the only way to do it. So the first time I learned about contract grading was from a colleague at North Dakota State University when I was had recently almost tenured. So at that point, I was teaching a large lecture course. I had 250 students a semester. I taught in a place just like Todd Odd on Pullman campus. So it was actually the theater. That's where oftentimes I was teaching, and the sets would be built behind me. And one time I came in to lecture and there was a toilet behind me. So I sat down and lectured from the throne. But I had tried a lot of interactive. I was an instructor that taught with active learning. I really approached my teaching from a growth mindset, but I could see that there was a mismatch between what I was communicating to my students and how they were able to demonstrate their mastery to me. And so I was talking with an instructor from Biology 101, the equivalent of Biology 107, and she said, "Oh my gosh, I just tried contract grading. It worked really well." And she had actually gotten the idea from the chemistry community. Here's an example of a contract that was used in organic chemistry. And in this case, it was where they communicated what a student needed to do to get a C. So if they met all of this stuff, they could get a C in the course. And you can see that it's not really surprising what's on there. Many of the things that for this particular contract that was required are things that you would just expect a student to do anyway. But it's making it very explicit how you want them to engage in the course, and reassuring them that if they do, you're pretty sure that they're going to achieve a C level of understanding. And so you're going to give that to them. Okay. For this particular instructor, Angie Hodgson, she was actually really concerned because she had a course that had high rates, DFW rates. And what she had noticed from her own scholarly work was that if her students got less than a C on the first exam, they were like 3 or 4 times more likely to fail the course, or to withdraw. And so she was really viewing this contract as a way to engage that set of students. Okay. And so what she did is she designed her own contract based on that one. And here's just some salient features of her contract. And if you want a copy of her contract, I'm happy to share it. I have a contract similar to this that I used in my large lecture course. What you'll see here is that there's nothing, these are things we would expect a dedicated student to do anyway. Okay. What Angie did was she asked them to keep all of this evidence in a portfolio, and they would bring their portfolio once a week to a study session that was run either by her or her learning assistants, so the equivalent of an undergraduate teaching assistant. And she sent the invitation for the contract grading after the first exam, and she sent it specifically to the students who got C or less for what I'm going to show you here. In later iterations of the course, she made it available to everybody in the course, but her initial foray in a contract grading was looking at those, what we're going to call high-risk students. And so you may want to know, like, what happened. Okay, so she kept track of in her course who who got the email and who decided they didn't want to take advantage of the contract. And I'm going to point out that these are only those at-risk students. Okay. And what she saw was that this was how they ended up at the end of the semester in their total points earned. Okay, so this is without a contract. How would they have scored in the course by the end of the semester? And she compared the frequency of students who didn't sign with those who completed. And what she saw was a shift, right? She didn't see any of those students who had withdraw, and she saw a shift of the distribution to the right. Now you might be saying, and she thought so too, she thought, well, this might just be kind of a selection bias where the students who are more highly motivated are going to be those that take advantage of the contract and sign it. And so therefore we would expect that those students do better anyway. Okay. But then she looked at those students who initially said they wanted to do the contract, but then just didn't end up doing it. So her deal was, if at any of those 1 week points of checking in, if you didn't complete the activities at that week, your contract was voided and she no longer promised you a C in the course. And what she saw there was a similar trend, that we're seeing a shift in those students that are achieving C's and B's and A's more often. She hasn't published this data. She's a professor of practice. She's a career track faculty member. She keeps these sort of data all the time for herself to monitor her own innovations. And these are the sorts of things that she actually includes in her promotion packets. What you're seeing here is that it was a statistically significant shift. It has a moderate effect size. And so these were an initial data that at least convinced Angie for her own teaching that this was something that might be useful. In subsequent semesters, she also did more robust analyses. So she used some regression modeling to control for students' prior knowledge, to control for student motivation, and this trend still holds, that the students who either completed or at least saw the contract and started on it did better and were more likely to go on to the next course. I did a similar experiment in my course. I saw the exact same trend. What I noticed about the students who voided the contract was that they were like, oh, these are the sorts of study skills that you want me to employ. I can do that. I don't need you to check off on my portfolio every week. That's what my exit interviews told me about those students. So there was something about this that made my students see that this was exactly what needed to be done in order to succeed in my course. Okay. Then I had a colleague who wanted to do it in an upper division course. And I was like, I don't get why you need to do it in an upper division course. I was naive. I was a junior faculty member. I didn't have as much experience as I do today. And, but she was really still very attuned to equity issues in her own course. And so she cued me in on an idea about, I'm going to call it sort of a hybrid model. And this is where we pulled together aspects of a guaranteed grade and we married them together with that self-evaluation and negotiation strategy. And so what that looked like was that students were told that they're exactly what they needed to do to get an A, a B, or a C. So it started with articulating what that minimum threshold was for passing. So it was a set of assignments that those students had to at least meet expectations on. So there were 3 distinctions. You either met expectations, you exceeded expectations, or you like knocked it out of the ballpark. Okay. And then to get a B or an A, there were additional assignments that needed to be completed by the students. And those all had to be completed at least competency for the B level. For the A level, it couldn't just be meets expectations. It had to be, all of them had to be exceeding or knocking it out of the ballpark for A. And the key about this one was that we actually asked students after the first week of school. So, we introduce them to the contract grading. We give them a week to experience what the course is going to be like. And then at the end of that week, we ask them to sign a contract communicating to us what grade they were shooting for. This was really transformative for me because I used to beat myself up when I looked at students who I knew were really, really like highly motivated students who were getting grades that I was confused by. And what I realized is that not all students want an A. I know that's probably obvious to all of you, but it was really transformative for me. Like our students are just, they are a whole person coming into our class. And I don't think I realized that as a young instructor. And so for some of these students, they were like, I don't need an A to do what I want to do next. And I have to work 2 jobs. And, I have to drive my grandma back and forth to chemo. So I'm okay with a B, thanks. And what that allowed for me was really to meet my students exactly where they were and trying to understand a little bit more about their situation. It was a really cool time for me doing this. The self-evaluation and negotiation piece was that I had multiple assignments that really were trying to tap into different competencies of the students. And so there was sort of a menu. They could choose a little bit of this and a little bit of this and a little bit of this. But for each of those assignments, there were clear guidelines about what was expected. And then there were rubrics that were attached to them. And then I had a suggested timeline for working on those assignments because there was always a hard due date for each of the assignments, but I wanted to give them opportunity for iteration and feedback. So on the suggested timeline I gave them, I recommended when I thought they should reach out to a peer and get feedback using the rubrics or checklists. And then I was always available to give them feedback if they wanted. But ultimately, once the deadline hit, they had to turn in the assignment. And generally, they were at a point where it was really good. They were where they wanted to be. But so I didn't have a lot of iteration past that. Some of you might ask, like, well, what about those students that chronically miss deadlines? I didn't have that experience with this set of students. That's not to say it wouldn't happen, but I was really strategic about how I set the deadlines so that my grading load would be distributed evenly over the semester, so I wouldn't be killing myself at any point in the semester. And I actually did that based on sort of what I was seeing in students' other courses. So I tried to make sure that I gave them deadlines that weren't when they had major assessments in the other courses that were required for their major. So that kind of helped with the timeline issue. I also invited them at the beginning of the semester, if you are contracting for an A or a B or a C, none of them contracted for a D, but like in your contract, I want you to look ahead at these deadlines. If you already know that you're going to have difficulty with a deadline, talk to me early. That is exactly what you would do as a professional. You would communicate with your team. You would find a way to meet the deadline. And so it's your responsibility, if you want to meet this contract, to come to me and tell me how we need to adjust a deadline. So that was really useful as well. Okay, so that's just a second example of contract grading and how we put together those three flavors. We've spent most of this time, me talking to you about the assessment piece, like how do you put together the contract grading? How would you do it? What would it look like? But I would say that that's not where you want to start. And it doesn't come as any surprise to those of you that are here. We don't start by thinking about how we want to assess. We really start by thinking, what is it that we want our students to know and be able to do at the end of our course, right? And then we determine what's the appropriate way to assess them. So let me give you an example of kind of what I'm thinking here. So many of you are familiar with Bloom's taxonomy. It's a way that we can characterize the cognitive level of a learning task that we give to students. And although it is hierarchical, that does not imply that any one of these is more or less important than the other. For example, if I want my students to be able to use data, interpret data to evaluate hypotheses, then they have to know something about the underlying content. In this case, they would need to know the basic language of biochemistry, and they would have to understand how to use it, right? So I don't want to place value on any of these, but just recognize that you too will have learning objectives. Some of them are going to be lower level, where you're developing their conceptual understanding, you're developing their vocabulary, you're developing maybe their understanding of frameworks, but then you're wanting them to get up to this higher cognition level. And then you're trying to like marry that perhaps with contract grading. And then it just gets all kind of messed up in our head. It gets to be too cognitively demanding for us to figure out how to design it. And so I think about how technology can help me. So for example, those lower level cognitive tasks that I need students to do, like learn the language of biochemistry or understand some very basics about it, I look toward Canvas as a way to support that. So you'll recall from one of those learning contracts that the instructor required that students got 70% or better on pre-class quizzes and homeworks. And you might be thinking, I do not want to grade all of those. Like, no, heck no, tech no. And I would say you don't have to grade them. If you're clever about thinking about technology, you can actually use it to support a competency-based approach. So, you know, in this example here, what is the basic level of language that my students need to have before they can do some of those more complex things? And then I design a system that will help them achieve it. And so for me, what that looks like is that I create pre-assessments that students can take as many times as they want. And as soon as they hit a threshold, whether that be 70% or 80% or 90%, then it clears them for me, right? And you can do that using Canvas. And you might be asking yourself, well, can't they just take it once and then remember what the answers are or look it up online? I would say that's the power of a test bank. So I have a test bank. Remember, these are lower level, like recall. So it's just about getting them practice. That's all I want them to do. If they're looking them up online, there's not going to be enough time because these are timed assessments. But this allows me to, you can imagine this would be part of contract grading where I want them to get 70% or higher. And I use Canvas to set that threshold and clear them for the next module once they've done it. I also think about my learning outcomes and how I can kill two birds with one stone. So here's an example of two learning outcomes, again, that I'm interested in. And all I'm saying to you is that in order, none of you are biochemists, well, one of you is, but in order to answer this sort of question, you would actually have to have proficiency at both of these. And so that also reduces the number of items that I have to create for students and allows that part of a contract grade to be a little bit easier. There's all sorts of good questions. Okay, so Stephanie, yes. So you're asking about accommodation issues of extended time. I can, for students who can't do, who require extra time with Canvas, you can give those students extra time and they can still have unlimited amounts. So I work with those students to find the right amount, even if they only get time and a half. Sometimes I'll give them 3 times. I really, for this case, because I'm just wanting them to get a basic proficiency with the language, I don't really care. They'll learn later on that that's going to hurt them on a later assignment, but I want them to have the practice, and the contract entices them to do it. Canvas gradebook is the question I'm getting in the chat from Jody. Jody, I did this way back when I had Blackboard, so I'm not entirely sure I can answer that question on the fly about Canvas. I personally am frustrated with Canvas gradebook, but that is something I'd be willing to think about more deeply offline and give work with people to come up with workarounds. All right, I wanted to leave time for questions, so we're right about there. What I want to say to you all is that there is absolutely no one-size-fits-all assessment. And so many of you, I know, I'm looking at the participant list, you already know that. Many of you are already designing your courses in a way that is attentive to diverse student needs, that uses principles of universal design. And we know from those principles that there is no one size fits all. So we just need to think about the various ways that we can engage with our students to honor their diverse perspectives and their varying abilities to achieve those outcomes that we have set out for them. So just to summarize, I think that because we're using, if you choose to use something like contract grading, it's convenient because it makes more clear what the expectations are for your students and it gives them some voice. And it's really focused on those competencies and levels of mastery that you want them to achieve. But to do that, you have to spend some time, even before you put your syllabus together, to think about what does it mean to really be a C-level student. What does passing look like? What is advanced? What does exceptional look like? And then codifying that and working backward to decide if contract grading is for you. If so, what aspects? You can still use other forms of assessment in concert with contract grading. It's certainly not all or nothing. Ideally, you want to put opportunities for students to practice and revise. The research on contract grading would tell us that that's going to be the most effective way to leverage it. And from my own personal experience and the experience of others, we felt that we saw dramatically less issues with academic integrity. I'm going to say that the first time I did contract grading, it was more time grading, but then I figured out what not to do and it became less. And I know for those students that were at risk when they left with better study skills. They had more self-regulated behaviors, and they certainly felt good going to the next course. So that was just, but that's anecdotal for those last pieces. So with that, I just want to open it up for questions, comments, tomatoes, just a real dialogue with you all. And I'm going to stop sharing so I can see all your faces.
Erika, yeah, I have a question, Philip. Did you say you had focused on a particular group of students for this initially? I might have, I thought I heard that briefly, but I wasn't quite sure.
Yeah, when I've done it, I've done it with my first foray in doing it was junior, senior level, large lecture course in the major. And then the next time I did it was a real interdisciplinary course. It was an upper division course with about 20 students. That was the one where I did they signed up ahead of time to let me know if they wanted an A, B, or a C. And there were lots of assessments or assignments in it. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
Kathy, what not to do? Okay. This is a great question. So with the 300, almost 300 students I had the first time I tried contract grading, I copied somebody who had done it in intro bio. She had 400 students. So I thought I could just do exactly what she did. But then I added on additional requirements because I was teaching students who were a little bit more advanced. That addition of extra requirements meant additional checking of their portfolios, which just translated to additional time, which was not, I didn't think carefully about the learning outcomes that I wanted for my students. That's the problem. And I didn't take the time that I needed before the semester started to think about the rhythm of when I would be checking those portfolios. And I was also did not partner with my instructional design team at the university to think about the ways that I could use technology to reduce my workload. So I had students with physical 3-ring binders with physical papers that I physically, either me or my learning assistants, checked off every week. Like that was the dumbest thing I ever could have done from the standpoint of time. But also I want to tell you that I changed it part of the way through, but I was like, yeah, bring your binders every Friday to class. Okay. There were so many that took advantage of the contract that I didn't have a way to carry them all back. So I had to bring a double jogging stroller to class to fill them up. And anyway, so don't do that. That was bad. I ended up translating it into Blackboard and we had a different timeline and it was much better. Electronic was better. Caitlin, I'm curious as to the suggested peer review you provided the type of just prior to this. Did you students actually engage in this? Yes. Okay. So Caitlin's question is about whether or not my students actually took advantage of the peer review, and they did. I think the reason they did, Caitlin, is because my class, that particular class, it was smaller, right? 20 to 30 students. And in class, we engaged in a lot of collaborative group work, which already entailed feedback to one another. So they were forming, they were really socially connected in that way. And so they were naturally already bringing stuff in and sharing. I don't know about a larger class. And I also, especially if it was a class that was very lecture based, I think there's something about creating that sense of belonging and connection and we're in it together that makes students feel like they can trust one another to give each other feedback. That's such a good question. Yeah, thank you for that. Other comments, fears, questions? Hey, Elizabeth, what's up?
Hi. I have never done contract grading, and I've always been a little scared of it. But I am wondering how you would address issues of flexibility. So I'm thinking about the students where you have a deadline and they're saying, well, I couldn't do it this week, but I could do it next week. And something came up and all of that sort of negotiating that goes on. One thing that I do in my class is do a lot of sort of like, if you do 8 out of 10, you get full points. You get to drop your lowest 2. All of that stuff sort of incorporates that like flexibility. So you don't have to make those decisions on the fly of like, well, that's an acceptable excuse for not getting it done at this time. How would you incorporate that kind of essence into this kind of grading?
I love this question so much. Thank you for asking that. I was talking about this actually with Jenny Watts because we're thinking about some of our upper division courses. And I did something, I don't know if I would call it contract grading, but I guess it is. It is actually contract grading. I just didn't know what it was. I early on in my graduate work at University of Arizona, I designed an assessment protocol that was like a menu. I actually sold it to my students as a menu. So I was like, here are the 5 big things that I want you to be able to do, right? Like some of it's a big project, some of it, but within each of those competencies that I wanted them to develop, I had assignments that went with it. And I said, you can choose whatever you want, but you have to do at least 2 from each or 3 from each. And I likened it to seriously like an actual, like you go out to eat menu. And I was like, everybody's going to have the whole course, the whole meal, but you may want to eat dessert first, go for it. But you only get to do 1 or 2 dessert ones. And everybody has to have vegetables. So you're going to have 3, but I don't care which of those 3 you have. And I don't care when you do them. So I tried to think about it in that way where, like you, it was flexible and that they only have to do a certain amount. And in that one, they chose their own deadline ahead of time for when they wanted to do and in what order. And that one worked pretty well. I think that one also worked well because we had more TAs. So there's that whole balance about who do you have to help you and planning ahead so that you don't put yourself in grading jail, which I have done more times than I care to count. Yep. I'm really good at putting myself in grading jail. Oh, yeah, Kathy. The first time so when I did it in my biochemistry course, it was optional. And I actually communicated to them the data that Angie had collected in her course. I said, in Biology 107, we see that students who take advantage of the contract are more likely to get the grade that they want, and they're less likely to fail or withdraw from the course. And I had 2 separate emails. One was for those students who didn't get a C on the first exam. And I said, her data, so if you'd like to take advantage of this, I can guarantee you a C. For everyone else, I just said, you should know that this option is available for students. You may or may not need it or want it. But I'm making it available to everyone. And so it was crazy. Like I had, students who you look at their transcript and they have a 4.0 average and they signed up for the contract grade. And I was super annoyed by that because that was another thing, like it took my time to check it. So for them, if I saw that they were doing great on exams, it was like a rubber stamp because they were going to get a C anyway. Yeah, I guess that goes into what I did wrong. I'm glad you asked that. It's been many years. I did a lot of wrong things. So try things. It might be wrong. I had some hands that were up. Shauna, I've done it both ways. I've done it where I have set the deadlines. I have also, and that's usually when I have more students. I've also done it if I have a really small class, like I've done it with graduate students. If it's a really small class, I let them set the deadlines. And I push back, right? Like I look at my schedule and I see I'm going to be gone for a conference or I have a grant that's due. Well, then there's a blackout date on when they can turn stuff in. But I don't know. I try and plan it. Want to go again?
Yeah, well, I have a little addendum to that because I really did try to be, I'm usually very rigid with my deadlines. That's just who I am, I guess. I'm really trying personally to be flexible. And so I was very flexible with my students this semester. And when I'm listening to you speak, my concern is that I have students that bite off more than they can chew often. And then they will set these deadlines for themselves. And I also implemented this collaborative feature, like you're talking about peer editing. And then what ends up happening is it kind of hoses their peer, right? If I put them in writing groups. So can you talk about that? Or does that just kick them out of the grading option? And so that's their consequence.
If it's assignments that require peer review or that require collaboration, then I'm more heavy-handed with the deadlines for the reason that you were just. Because it's right, fairness, and it's get it done.
Mm-hmm.
If it's other assignments where most of the onus is on them, they're not required to, then I let them choose. But I would say it depends on what level you're teaching. If I'm teaching 100, 200 level courses, I'm going to need to help coach them so that they don't bite off more than they can chew. And if they're juniors and seniors, hopefully I have a smaller course. I might let them bite off more than they can chew, but that's where, remember, they sign up in advance about what they're contracting for. And if they bit off more than they can chew, then they can schedule a meeting with me to recontract. And at that point we can talk about, and I invite them and I actually remind them every couple of weeks. I'm like, how are you feeling about your contract? Because they can renegotiate up too. Some of them take it the conservative route where they contract for a B and then they realize that they're on track. So they contract for an A. And others realize that they bit off more than they can chew and they want to talk about how they can achieve it. Or they're like, you know what? I'm cool with a B. So, but again, it's the maturity of the student where they're at in their program. I think it's really important for juniors and seniors to have some opportunities to have some safe failure so that they can learn that skill before they leave the nest. But I'm certainly not trying to set them up for failure.
Thank you.
Yeah. And I tell you what, if you Google contract grading, everyone else is going to tell you their experience too, and it will be different from mine. And if you Google it along with your own kind of student population, you might get some other ideas too. Okay, I'm going to put up one slide before you go. And it's this like desperate plea for feedback about what we should do next year for pit stops, folks. Whoops, no, go back. What do you want to do? Let me know. And if you want to give one, let me know. And I'll put this in the chat too, but I definitely want to thank you all for coming today. It's been great to hear your questions, and I'm excited that on a Thursday, you're all here in the afternoon.
Thanks for your hard work, Erika. You're really a stalwart. So.
Oh, thanks, Phil. I'm glad you were here.